Okay, it is exactly 2 o'clock, and we welcome you back to the session number 4 of WATS version 11. I'm delighted to be here. I'm Hakim Al-Rustam, and I have the honor to chair this final panel on occupation, war of liberation, and the establishment of violence as a tool of rule. So the first paper is by David Gaunt from Södertörn University. Did I pronounce it right? And
good enough.
Okay, thank you. The floor is yours.
So, does this work? Okay.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Thank you very much, my dear WATS friends. This is my 6th time at your workshops, and you have opened up for the Assyrians inside the narrative of the Armenians and Turkish history. I'm very grateful for that, and I think the Assyrians are even more grateful, probably. Now, as many of you may not even realize, the Assyrians are a rather obscure people. I have yet to see in a general history of the Ottoman Empire a single mention of the Assyrians. It just doesn't happen. And even I didn't know anything about the Assyrians 25 years ago. But my university, which we were building up newly, is in the middle of one of the largest diasporas of Assyrians in the world. And my students urged me to study them. One of the reasons for their obscurity, which is also a trap for them, is that they were very good at the art of not being governed. They were in places that were very, very hard to get to, in terrain that was impossible. It was not worthwhile for the Ottoman military to actually go in and try to control it for a long, long time. Now, the problem with being not governed is that there are very few sources in the Ottoman archives about them. Nobody gives speeches about them. There are no newspapers, no intellectuals, no intelligentsia, no middle class either. And they are surrounded by neighbors like Armenians, which they got along rather well with, and Kurds, to which they were also relatively well integrated in tribal warfare. So I have 2 cases I will talk about of how the Assyrians adjusted to the Kemalist Republic. One of submission and being subaltern, and the other of being armed and defensive. Both strategies failed, and the Assyrians were pushed out of the Republic of Turkey's territory. So I'll begin with the Syrian Orthodox submission, which is more complicated. At the Paris Peace Treaty negotiations, the Syrian Orthodox Church participated with a representative who was an archbishop, and probably the only person in the hierarchy who could speak French. They presented statistics about the losses of their congregation, the number of bishops who were killed, the number of churches ruined, and they lobbied together with other Assyrian groups. There are many different denominations for an independent Assyrian state, or at least autonomy within a Kurdish or Armenian state. This, of course, fell on very deaf diplomatic ears. And as the Kemalist nationalists became more powerful, the church changed its position from wanting to be autonomous and independent to being totally submissive pledging loyalty to Turkey, calling themselves Turks, not wanting minority status at all. And this became the position of the of the Orthodox Church until very recently. So denying, even in front of its surviving co-religionists, that massacres had actually taken place, a very strange form of denialism. Now, this did not succeed, as submission. The patriarch was stripped of his Turkish citizenship. He was not allowed back into Turkey. He had to find a new patriarchal seat in Damascus. Many of the survivors who were in Urfa or Mardin or other places were forcibly deported and had to sign a petition that they were doing this voluntarily. This left, after a while, only a small enclave around the town of Midyat, now a tourist attraction in the southeastern part. And these people survived in place up until the Cyprus crisis and this Gastarbeiter, the program that the Germans had leaving them. The only exception, and I write about that in a paragraph, were some Assyrians who joined the Sheikh Said revolt, and even a smaller one led by Hajo of the Haverkan. They were executed, as well as some others who were not associated with this revolt. The other case was that of an armed attempt by the Nestorians to reconquer their homes that they were forced to leave in Hakkari in 1915. I write about that in the book, but I won't go into details. They were, after the war, placed in refugee camps in Iraq, among others, Bakuba, where were employed as mercenaries for the British in their air bases and the like. A force of about 5,000 Assyrian warriors tried to move back into Hakkari in 1920. They were armed by the British and led by some British officers. But as soon as the soldiers got near to their homes, they sort of left. And how am I doing for time?
3 more minutes.
Okay. So this failed as an attempt to recapture territory. But some did remain in their homes, and later some others filtered in. So by about 1924, a few thousand families Assyrians were living in Hakkari, when an incident occurred that a gang of Assyrians captured a local governor and killed some of his entourage. And this led to an enormous, disproportionately large Turkish military campaign to force the remaining Assyrians out of Hakkari, which much bloodshed and suffering, and several of the League of Nations commissions that were in place in order to establish the border with Mosul and Turkey reported on this. And the Turkish side, as usual, denied all allegations. So by 1925-26, the greater part of the Assyrian genocide survivors had been pushed out of the Republic of Turkey. Only the tiny enclave of the Syriac Orthodox villages around Midyat had gotten some sort of protection, as long as they kept their heads down. In essence, the driving out of the Assyrian Christians was the last step of the genocide of Turkey's Christian minorities, and naturally part of probably a greater policy of Turkifying territory. the Assyrians were indigenous peoples to the land. Even using the name Assyrians was a political intention to show that they were indigenous, going back to the Old Testament times. But the Assyrians, because of their small population, their very, very split nature into rival churches, their insignificance could hardly be seen as a threat to the Ottoman Empire or the Turkish Republic. They're just not that important. So we should probably go back to what Keith was talking about yesterday, that this is settler colonialism in order to remove people from a territory to repopulate it with another population. And that led to their eradication despite strategies of submission or armed resistance. Thank you. Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought it was loud. We're going.
Thank you very much. The second paper, and apologies, David, I didn't read the title of your paper, which was Expulsion, Submission, or Survival, Assyrian Christians in the Early Republic Period. The second paper on the panel is by Ari Shakarian, The Armistice Complex and the Foundation of the Republic of Turkey, Revisiting the Precarious Situation of the Armenian Community.
Thank you. Can I put this here maybe? No. Well, thank you very much for having me, Professor Suni and Göçek. And thank you very much for all of you for those great papers. I really learned a lot from the previous 3 sessions. Thank you very much. So I prepared a 10-minute presentation text, and probably this will be my first 10-minute presentation in entire of my career. So I will follow a text to, complete within 10 minutes. And here we go. So the demands of Armenians and Greeks for self-determination during the armistice years, which is from 1918 to 1923, made them, quote-unquote, a traitors and fifth column in the eyes of Turkish ruling elite, intellectuals, and public. When the Turkish national movement, led by Mustafa Kemal, consolidated its power in the Anatolian Peninsula and declared the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923, the remaining non-Muslim populations that remained within the borders of this new Turkey were viewed with suspicion. The armistice image of non-Muslims celebrating a foreign occupation persisted, and it would become a major justification used by the Turkish nationalists when seeking Muslim support for targeting these new minority groups in early Republican years. So in this paper, I argue that during the early Republican years, when the issue of minority populations became a topic of debate, there was an armistice complex among the Turkish ruling elite, intellectuals, and wider public. This armistice complex was a response to the political activities and collaboration of Armenians and Greeks with the Allied occupation, portrayed these communities within the newly established republic as quote-unquote potential threats. They had to be isolated, kept under surveillance, and their loyalty constantly tested to protect the territorial integrity and national identity. So how the Armenian community leadership and dailies reacted against these nationalist state policies during the early Republican years, how education and identity policies of nationalist regime affected the life of post-genocide Armenian community now centered in Istanbul. So I answered these questions through providing examples of political responses of the Armenian community leadership, as well as Armenian press in response to these state policies. So First, I focused on the education policies because it was in education especially that these discriminatory state policies targeted non-Muslim communities who were left in Turkey. The nationalist elite viewed non-Muslim schools as an obstacle to the assimilation of young generations, young Armenian Greek generations. Because the preservation of the Armenian identity was closely attached to the church and community schools, so the nationalist authorities aimed at controlling these institutions by introducing new regulations. The closure of Armenian schools in Istanbul would have resulted in the assimilation and acculturation of the community in the subsequent decades, with young generations forgetting their language and culture. The government turned its attention first to the non-Muslim and French, German, and American private schools in Istanbul, focusing on the Turkification of their curricula. This entailed increasing Turkish language, history, and culture classes for non-Muslim students and decreasing the native Greek, Armenian, and Ladino in this case, and foreign language classes, while pressuring school administrations by increasing Turkish teachers' salaries and forcing non-Muslim teachers to resign. So none of the European countries that signed the Treaty of Lausanne, France, England, Italy, or Greece, objected these state practices, which was against the articles of the Treaty of Lausanne. In addition to imposing more Turkish education, the Directorate of Education assigned investigators who visited these non-Muslim schools regularly and searching for, I quote, dangerous books and maps, ordering the removal of religious symbols from the walls, and meeting with the Turkish teachers to discuss the progress in implementing this state-approved curriculum. So, as scholars Lerna Ekmekçioğlu and Talin Sucuyan discussed in their work, due to agitations of Turkish press and the nationalist policies introduced by the government, the Armenian community found itself in a precarious atmosphere in which the burden rested on them to prove the Turkish state and the society that they were, I quote, loyal citizens of the Republic. Supin Nuri, a writer of the, Supin Nuri, a writer for the İleri Forward newspaper, set his sights on the non-Muslim communities of the newly established Turkish state as early as December 1923, claiming that non-Muslims were revolting, baş kaldırmak, and not being loyal to the Republic. His remarks embody the spirit of the state policies. I quote, "After winning the war, our duty has not come to an end. We should not rest. See the situation of the minorities today. What was their situation when we took back Izmir? Then they were afraid. Their faces changed color. Some put fasts on their head. Some fled the country or started to inform authorities against their friends. Today, the situation has changed. Now they are returning from abroad, and the government should closely surveil the Armenians and Greeks, not allow them to open their eyes. Gözlerini açtırmamak. The government should implement decisive policies against the Greeks, Jews, and Armenians." So although the Republic's constitution and the provisions of the Treaty of Lausanne guaranteed equal rights to Armenians as Turkish citizens, a travel ban imposed on Armenian citizens. No Armenian from Istanbul was allowed to travel outside of the city limits. Similarly, Armenians were prohibited from traveling to Istanbul from Anatolian towns and cities. Armenian merchants who traveled from Anatolia to Istanbul were not allowed to return back to their villages. Even Armenians residing in neighborhoods such as Pendik, Kartal, Maltepe, modern-day Istanbul towns located on the Anatolian side, they were also not allowed to travel to Istanbul, even if they went for work or they had businesses inside the city. So in response to these nationalist policies, Armenian Patriarchate gave some interviews. For example, Azniv Aharonyan, an official from the Armenian Patriarchate, he gave an interview to the Cumhuriyet Republic Daily, asserting that Armenians were, I quote, 100% poor Turks, end quote. He insisted that, again I quote, Armenians were Turks, but not Muslims, end quote. And the Armenian community were ready to follow the orders of state. Patriarchate's official, Azim Aharonyan, described the Armenian community as following orders of the state and as being complete, loyalty to the republic. So did the leadership's pro-state moves bring any positive development for the Armenian community? An influential author, Ethem Izzet, editor of popular newspapers such as Tevhid, Milliyet, Son Telegraph, and Son Telegraph, he wrote an article about Armenian and Greek community in which he declared, I quote, Armenian is Armenian, Greek is Greek. Certainly it is impossible that they become fellow Turkish citizens. No bite of Turkish bread passes through their throats without ingratitude. They proved this hundreds of times, thousands of times. There is no far or close distance between us. There is a cliff. Neither the Constitution nor any power can eliminate this cliff and join our hands together. Their citizenship, their Turkishness, and the claim that they are children of this country are nothing but fantasy and lies. End quote. As I outlined in this paper, the travel ban imposed on the Istanbul Armenians in the very first years of the young republic was perhaps the first blow to the hope of civic nationalism that Armenians expected from the Republican regime. Contrary to the idea of equality between citizens, this ban was imposed only on ethnic Armenians. The state increased its authority over the Armenian schools through new regulations, and provocative publications targeting Armenians in Turkish press became chronic during the first decade of the Republic. So under these circumstances, the Armenian leadership in Istanbul accommodated these repressive state policies, and there were no bold requests made by the community. Yet the Republican regime, assisted by Turkish intellectuals and press, advanced its nationalist agenda during the early Republican years, and historical analysis of this period through the lens of Armenian and Ottoman Turkish newspapers offers insights into precarious situation of the Armenian community in the early Republican decades and provides an important historical background for the Turkish-Armenian relations. Thank you. Good to know.
The third paper is by Javad Dargin, Roadlessness, Ottoman Modernity, Navigating Uncharted Dersim.
It's like the Indian peace pipe. Whoever has the pipe.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just posing for a photo. The title of my talk, as you see, have changed, and this piece has actually been recently published by the Journal of Historical Geography with a very long title suggested by the editor. And I accepted without any revisions. And as you see, I'm not gonna read. So today I'm going to talk about Dersim, and as Armenian travelers named Antranik Yeritzian, who visited the region in 1888, called Dersim, I quote, a completely foreign land that many people had talked about, but few had seen. And I think that has not changed over more than a century, but I know that some people here has seen Dersim. So in this paper, I explore the complex interactions between territoriality, sovereignty, and power, as well as their historical geographies through the case of Dersim in Eastern Anatolia over the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In this period, various ethnic, religious, and religious groups, including Arabs, Armenians, Kurds, Albanians, Pontus, and Alevis, emerged as colonial questions for the Ottoman state elites, even while the European state elites viewed the Ottoman Empire itself as a question under the banner of Eastern question or the sick man of Europe metaphor. Does this work? Okay. Late Imperial Ottoman and Republican Turkish elites sought to create a centralized nation state imagined as a Sunni Turkish community and its homeland, Anatolia. Anything that could challenge the triangle congruity between the cultural unit, the nation, the political unit, the state, and the territorial unit, homeland, was deemed a problem to be resolved. This is not, of course, completely my theory. Ernst Gellner has this theory of congruity between political and cultural unit. I'm just adding the territorial, and these have in this period started to be imagined as homogeneous units that will overlap and create a less diverse, actually a single identity, and anything that will challenge this will need to be eliminated to fulfill a new understanding of sovereignty. 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War posed a more significant existential threat to the Ottoman Empire than its previous war-related losses to the Russians. The war was a pivotal moment in Dersim's history, prompting the Ottoman administration to escalate its colonization efforts in the region. This was driven by the region's growing proximity to the eastern frontier of the Russian Empire and prevailing distrust between the Sunni-dominated Ottoman administration and the Kızılbaş of Dersim. As you see in this map, the upper left, the dark green area corresponds to Dersim, and this is a Russian military map titled The Distribution of the Kurds, but it also shows Armenians, Assyrians, Alevis, and other ethno-religious communities, and Yazidis in the black dots right at the edges in the south. Now, this map tells a lot about the level of Russian colonial ambitions in this part of the region, but I think it also shows us that we probably need more workshops on Kurdish-Armenian relations, as they largely share the same territory. And this is before genocide. This is before everything, mostly, maybe slightly after or around the time of the Hamidian massacres in 1890s. So the state elites in three different political periods, Tanzimat, Hamidian, Young Turk, and early Republican, but I largely focus on the last three, describe Dersim as an anomaly, a boil, or a disease that needed to be removed from the otherwise healthy body of their imagined nation, homeland, and state. Hasan Hilmi, a Hamidian-era governor of Memuratil Aziz, today's Elazığ, likened Dersim to an old boil, Chaban, in the lungs and the heart of Anatolia's body. In 1908, a member of the Committee of the Union and Progress called Dersim a massive disease that had taken the form of necrosis, requiring medical intervention. Similarly, during the Republican era, Civil Inspector Hamdi Bey also described Dersim as a boil whose removal was necessary for the homeland's salvation. The similarity in these accounts across three distinct political regimes is remarkable. But why did the state elite speak of Dersim this way? For them, any region lacking in state control, devlet otoritesinden mahrum, inherently threatened the state's well-being and maintenance and preservation. That's the other key concept, devletin bekası, which is still relevant in contemporary Turkish politics. In this, Dersim was a regional example of a new relationship between power and territory. As Prime Minister İsmet İnönü would put it, during 1937's military operations, Turkish soldiers strolled through the inaccessible alleys of Dersim as if they were the streets of Ankara, the capital, where the state authority was believed to be most effectively and directly implemented. Underpinning such statements was the desire to make Dersim and Ankara part of the same homogeneous space, the national territory. This modern ideology was not only to create an imagined community, as per Benedict Anderson, but also an imagined territory that would include places such as Dersim, where state elites complained no soldier had seen, despite centuries-long Ottoman and Turkish sovereignty in the region. One of the earliest descriptions of Dersim, accompanying a topographical map of the region, came from John Taylor, the British Consul General of Kurdistan. Kurdistan, and in this time, was an official province, eyalet in Ottoman Empire in 1866. Taylor was astonished by the shortcuts through Dersim's mountains, which he described, a country hitherto quite unknown to Europeans. He was also surprised to discover that there existed a remarkably easy route that had never been traversed by civilized beings, and which had hitherto concealed from foreigners due to the Kurds' jealousy, as they did not wish it to be known that an easy route existed, and such an easy route existed through their formidable mountains. Armenian traveler Yeritzian, who spent several years in Dersim in 1890s, claimed that the Kurds in Inner Dersim had always been independent of the Ottomans, due largely to characteristics of their its inhabitants, as well as the unconquerable nature of the region, which by itself fights the foreigner and the enemy. These are his words. Even though it might sound strange, Yeritzian added, Dersim appeared like a state within state. An Ottoman perspective was provided in 1880 by Ferik Fazlı Pasha, the commander of the Ottoman Reform Division, responsible for bringing places like Dersim under state control. The area's military barracks, he complained, had no significant authority over the interior, and despite several military operations, this is 1880, to reform Dersim, the government has not yet been able to annihilate this menace. In 1908, official Hayri Bey said that Dersim had remained unconquered for past 500 years, indicating that despite centuries of Ottoman rule, Dersim had been left outside a formal state mechanism. In a book titled Overlord and Dersim, written in 1820s, Naşit Hakkı Ulu, a famous embedded journalist who will have a long career in politics later, compared Dersim to Tibet, arguing that while many explorers had crossed Tibet, Dersim has not been subject to even bird's eye view of anyone other than that of the state officials and military officers. Late 19th and early 20th century Ottoman administrators produced increasingly more detailed maps of Dersim and other peripheral regions of the empire to bring such places under direct state control. This is the earliest map in Ottoman archives, which is supposed to show the roads in Murat al-Aziz and Dersim. It's around here. It says Khozat. This is a French inscription, and as you see, there are no roads. It appears as an empty space, basically. The first Ottoman publication to use military geography in its title was published in 1892, and in 1895 the Ottoman governor established its first mapping commission. The map drawing school, Harita Aks Tarsim Okulu, started to educate cartographers or mapping officers in 1916, and the Ministry of National Defense founded its mapping department in 1918. Are we almost done? Or we're done? Okay. So I'm just gonna, this is the gist of the story is that this mapping technology continues to evolve across all three of these regimes, and it becomes more and more detailed with military inscriptions showing the existence of the military stations. This is 1922. This is like in the midst of all the, the wars that we have been talking about in the workshop. And here, 1923, a year later, they produced village-level maps of Dersim. And this is just an example, but they had many of them showing all the villages and the existing state structures in different parts of Dersim. And then by 1937, we see Dersim as an occupied and militarized region, with some parts of it as depopulated. And then this is an iconic image published in a book titled Dersim is opening, Tunceli is opening up to civilization, which is its own new name. And it just shows the quote unquote civilized institutions in
Ashvartinik, that's where I'm from. My family's. Ashvartinik, do you see on the left?
There you're from Dersim, then.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right there. That's the geography that the state elite,
Yes.
considered part of historical Dersim.
Ashvartinik, yeah, it means
And-
rose bush, right?
Yeah, and finally, this is the final final kind of map that represents Dersim as a completely militarized region.
Wow.
So basically, over time, there is this. With this, I'm trying to show the continuity in map making and its role in the colonization of the region across the Hamidian, Young Turks, and the Republican periods. Thank you.
The fourth paper by Bahram Der Matevosyan, Armenian Interpretations of Kemalism in the 1920s and 40s, Rethinking Intellectual Debates on Turkey's Ideological Foundations.
Thank you very much. Now, for 2 days, we have been saying how Iran was very strict on the timing. And then I was asking there should be consistency. And then I realized that the 11th workshop is taking place on the 11th day of the 11th month. So we see consistency. So 105 years ago, on this day, we'll know that on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, then armistice was signed. So yes, there is some.
We tried to change the year, but it didn't work.
So what I want to do for the remaining 9.5 minutes, I want to talk about an emerging field that is called transnational history of Kemalism. Some 10, 13 years ago, we saw the rise of number of interesting publications written by Stefan Ehring, Naim Qureshi, Panache Dosniego, and Jacob Landau about how Kemalism was perceived in the 1920s and 30s by those countries who had direct bilateral or multilateral relations with the Kemalist regime. And then in 2011, the French Institute of Anatolian Studies conducted an interesting workshop about how Balkans perceive Kemalism, and they brought together scholars from Egypt. Egypt is not there, but from Albania, from Bulgaria, also from Iraq, Egypt. They came together and they wrote very interesting chapter, edited book about Kemalism, how these countries perceive. And then what was interesting, I came to realize that the Soviet perspective was missing. So I wrote the book on that, which was published in 2019, and which was translated this year into Turkish by Iletişim. But when I was writing the Soviet perspectives, I came across with just two instances of Armenian interpretations of Kemalism, and then I came to realize there should be more than these two instances, and then I promised myself to write a paper on this, and then when this call for papers came up, and then I said, this is time, so I have to sit down and write. So thank you for that push. Now, what is really fascinating about the Armenian interpretations of Kemalism in the 1920s and 30s is we are seeing a nation traumatized, further divided after the First World War, after the collapse of the short-lived Armenian Republic, after the creation of the Soviet Union, and when one part of the Armenian nation went to the diaspora, mostly political and military elite of Armenia, went to Middle East, to Europe, to the States. The other elite remained in Armenia,
And so it was really interesting how Armenian intellectuals and Armenian politicians, former politicians, looked at Kemalism. So, and then when we look at it, we see two completely diverging perspectives. Within diaspora, we see two categories, how Kemalism was perceived, how Kemalism was interpreted. On the one hand, we have this group of scholars and politicians and intellectuals which are saying Turkey is about to collapse. Kemalism has no future. Kemalism is doomed. It's the Kemalist Turkey is the final days are counted. It's around the corner. Just wait a little bit and then you'll see. And these ideas are forwarded by people like Simon Veratsa, the former prime minister of the First Republic, Ahmet Aharonyan, the speaker of the Armenian parliament, or Ruben Demirel, the former minister of defense of the First Republic. On the other hand, the second category are those people which have completely different understanding and interpretations of Kemalism. They are arguing that, you know, why don't you go a little bit easy on this? Whatever you are saying has no data, there is no hands-on experience. Whatever you are saying, you have political agenda. Why don't you drop all your outlandish interpretations of Turkey? Whatever you see in Turkey happening is based on decades of reforms, decades of revolutionary movements, decades of experience. So they were arguing that we don't know Turkey. We have to know Turkey from within. Turkey is a different country nowadays. Kemalist Turkey has been able to capitalize on the reforms of the previous decades. And these were said by people like Hay Gunduni, which was one of the high-ranking military officials of the First Republic, Carlos Sassouni, who was the former governor of Alexandropol, and Shahan Natali, one of the masterminds of the Nemesis operation. So, and then we see how Kemalism becomes a matter of debate between these two groups. They write reviews, and essays in Armenian newspapers like Droshak, like Haydenik, and like Haraj, and they criticize each other. It's 1920s. And I want to remind that the term Kemalism hasn't been born yet. But in Armenian newspapers, in Armenian public discussions, public discourse, you could see how Kemalism, with its ideological connotations and explanatory framework, is discussed by Armenian intellectual elite. The same was also happening in Soviet Armenia. Now let's look at the Soviet Armenia. What was going on there? Until 1927, which I consider as a turning point in the Soviet perspectives on Kemalism. On that day, on 1927, Stalin makes the famous speech where he defines Kemalism. He comes up with an official definition of Kemalism, which becomes the reference point for all Bolshevik and later on other historians and observers of Turkey. So in that famous definition of Kemalism, again, 1927, he sets the platform that all other scholars of Soviet Union had to refer to in order to explain what was going on in Turkey. And then there were two newspapers in Armenia, Khorotain Hayastan, Soviet Armenia, and Avangard, which just covered news from Turkey, no going into details, no commentaries. But then in 1928, something interesting happens in Armenia. Academic journal Noruri, New Pass, was being printed, which lasted only 3 years. And they started to debate with diaspora Armenian intellectuals remotely. Basically, again, arguing scholars like Yepremian, like GK, is an observer who had this pen name, and Arsharuni and others, who were arguing remotely with those Armenians like Veratsan, Aharonyan, Ruben, again criticizing them that you are not understanding what's going on in Turkey. Leave your agenda aside. We have to understand Turkey if we want to really understand in order to understand the Turkish agenda, we have to stop being superficial about Turkey. And then they also explaining the Armenian interest in the Kemalist Turkey and so on and so forth. When we look into more details, we understand that Ruben Derminasyan, which in the Armenian context is considered one of the strategic thinkers of the First Republic until now, he's very much revered for his skills of analysis on strategies, how Armenia should develop its regional strategy. He was heavily criticized in the Armenian press. And so what we come to see that by 1929, there is a shift happening in the interpretations. The Armenian interpretations, especially in the diaspora, become more nuanced, more balanced. They stop seeing that Kemalist reforms are going to collapse. In the Soviet interpretations, you see how the experiment in 1930 of an opposition party opens a door for some excitement amongst Soviet observers. That this shows how Kemalist regime is corrupt, is going to fall. But then it was just that instance. So to conclude, what we understand by looking at the Armenian perspectives, we see quite nuanced understanding of Kemalism, at least on the one that on the level that I described, which were quite critical of those who were very radical in their interpretation. So these scholars were saying we have to understand Turkey from within. And until nowadays, why this research is interesting? Until nowadays, you have quasi-intellectual milieus in Armenia, which are claiming that Turkey is about to collapse. Turkey is about to collapse. So we see continuity of these superficial interpretations, and whether they are connected with this diaspora, some group of diaspora which believe in this, it remains to be seen. So therefore, this research will open new opportunities for me to understand whether there is any consistency, continuity, and try to understand the roots of this line of thinking in the Armenian context. Thank you.
Number 11. And what is it? Okay, so I'm giving myself 10 minutes as well to just open up some of the stuff in the papers that hasn't been said but are in the actual written one. So in this fascinating tapestry of historical narratives, our speakers today unraveled the threads that connect the critical, eventful period surrounding the establishment of the Republic of Turkey. Each paper presented here delves into distinct facets of this complex period, shedding light on the experiences of marginalized communities and narratives, the strategic maneuvers of the Ottoman Empire in the face of collapse, and the intellectual debates that permeated the early decades of the 20th century. From the expulsion, survival, or submission of Assyrian Christians to the armistice complex shaping the destiny of the Armenian community, and from the challenges of the Ottoman modernity to mapping Dersim and the profound Armenian interpretations of Kemalism, the panelists covered the landscapes of occupation, liberation, and the intricate interplay of violence as a tool of rule. So the paper considers Anatolia in what Edward Said calls as intertwined histories and overlapping territories, navigating the complex history of Anatolia and its populations. David's paper sheds light on the experiences of the largely understudied Assyrian Christians in southeastern Turkey during the early years of the Republic. Assyrians or Syrianese navigated the complex landscape of shifting political dynamics, border negotiations, and government policies. The paper outlined various strategies employed by the Assyrians to counter Turkish government attempts at assimilation and expulsion, from the armed resistance as seen in the failed attempt by the Nestorians to return in 1920, to the Syriac Orthodox patriarchy strategy of total submission. Each approach had distinct consequences, and the Assyrians faced forced deportations, loss of property, and massacres, especially during what the Turkish authorities at the time labeled as the Nestorian Uprising of 1924-25. The paper shows how the Assyrians' history is very much intertwined with Armenians and Kurds of the region, and adds yet another layer of complexity to the way we read this history in a multi-layered, complex way. The paper delves into the understudied topics, namely, and this is what I find the most fascinating, is the southern borders of the Lausanne Treaty and what became known as the Turkish-Iraqi border. It is notable that we continue to read the Lausanne Treaty within its Balkan context, and this is really a timely intervention. But if the Syrians read Lausanne as applied to the Jewish, Rum, and Armenian communities, here I'm thinking that perhaps they are not at fault in a way, because the Turkish state did not think that Lausanne applied outside of Istanbul, both on the discursive and the practical level, because the three so-called non-Muslim millets, who became non-Muslim minority structure that predated Lausanne and the Syrianese, were subsumed under the Armenian millet. But I'd like to hear more from you about the ambiguities of Lausanne when it comes to Anatolia, especially the Syrianese, that remains understudied, and it's a complete puzzle for me personally. So thank you for this. Ari's paper explores the complex relationship between the wider Turkish society and the Armenian community in the crucial early decades of the Republic. Focused on post-genocide Armenians, the paper specifically examines how the nationalist regime's education and identity policies impacted their lives, to answer two questions: how the Armenian community leadership and press reacted to the nationalist state policies, and how the education and identity policies of the nationalist regime affected the life of post-genocide Armenians in Istanbul. Ari contends that despite the efforts of the Armenian community to demonstrate loyalty to the new nationalist regime, they faced discrimination in policies, and the paper examines various instances such as travel bans, discriminatory laws, and economic measures, showcasing the precarious situation of Armenians. The armistice complex, and here I was also thinking about the Sevr complex, and now there is the Lausanne complex, and somehow, all of these events of our complexes continue to, I think it needs a Freudian reading, really. But that armistice complex, stemming from suspicions of collaboration during wartime, played a significant role in shaping state policies towards non-Muslim communities, namely the Armenians and the Rus. The contribution of the paper lie in providing historical insights into Turkish-Armenian relations during this period, and highlighting the tensions between civic and secular rhetoric of the nationalist movement and the discriminatory practices faced by the Armenian community that is also intertwined with the Rus. So, examining the responses of the Armenian community leadership and press, the paper contributes to our understanding of Turkish-Armenian relations in the early Republican period, offering historical insights often overlooked in existing narratives. So, and here I have a question. In examining the responses of the Armenian community leadership and press to nationalist state policies, did you encounter instances where their efforts led to tangible positive outcomes for the community during the early Republican years? Now, we know how this ended up happening or not happening in the long term, but did it have any effect at the time? I have another question, but we'll keep that for later. And for Javad's paper that explores the historical geographies of violence in Dersim, examining the period between 1866 and 1939. Focusing on Ottoman and Turkish state efforts to integrate Dersim in its territories through a knowledge-power lens, mapping military operations and the imposition of state control over territories. Javad argues that these actions were driven by a desire for territorialization, state sovereignty, and resource exploitation, leading to the erasure of local governance systems and the imposition of a homogeneous population and territory, at least on the level of perception. The key contributions of the paper are in shedding light on the intersection of cartography, violence, and state formation as they unraveled in Dersim and within a temporality that goes from the late Ottoman through the Republican period, and emphasizing the role of maps in shaping the perception and the construction of the region, ideologically illustrating how they were used to symbolize civilization, quote unquote, control and erasure of non-state entities, and challenging the dichotomy between East and West, suggesting that the state activity actively participated in Orientalism and colonialism, and also Orientalism as colonialism. And here is a question about bringing it to the contemporary. In the conclusion, you discuss the ongoing tension between the state's official narrative, reflecting, among others, the naming choice from Tunceli to Dersim, between Dersim to Tunceli, and the intricate history of the region. How do you see this tension continuing in the present, given also the recent apology that Erdogan issued? And the fourth, Bahram's paper seeks to show how the Armenian intellectuals and the former political and military elite members looked at Turkey's Kemalist transformation, which again has rarely been examined. The paper explores the Armenian perspectives on Kemalism during the 1920s, shedding light on a relatively unexplored aspect of the transnational history of Kemalism, and this is fascinating. It's the first time I hear about that aspect of trying to understand Kemalism, and now you're thinking about it, I couldn't help but think about how Kemalism influenced not only Iran, in not only the Balkans, but also Iran, in Egypt, Afghanistan, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhoods in Egypt as well, up to British India. So it's fascinating. It focuses on the interpretation and debates among Armenian intellectuals and former political and military elites regarding Turkey's Kemalist revolution. The main question driving the article is how these Armenian figures perceived and analyzed the challenges occurring in Turkey under Kemal's leadership, with three main points that I find fascinating that perhaps open up a discussion. Is the paper highlights the diverse viewpoints within the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the ARF, the political party that played a significant role in Armenian politics. And the second, examining how Armenians in the Soviet Union, particularly within the framework of Soviet ideologies and geopolitics, interpreted Kemalism. Soviet Armenian perspectives aligned with the broader Soviet approaches shaped by Marxist, Leninist lenses and geopolitical consideration. And the third is the motivation of Armenians, both in the diaspora and the Soviet Union, to closely observe Turkey's transformation, who were influenced by distinct political agendas. And here I just want to have a question. Is there, and I kept wondering about this while reading, is there further explanation beyond distrust and revenge that informed the Armenian speculations of and hope for the collapse of Kemalist Turkey? So overall, together, these papers offer a nice, good mosaic of perspectives that invite us to reevaluate and consider the foundational moments that shaped the Republic of Turkey, which really has been the privileged focus of the successive WATS meetings, and it is very fitting to be also the topic of the last panel of the last WATS. So thank you for this. Are we opening the
Wherever you like.
floor? Yeah, I think let's open the floor and then you can incorporate.
Yeah, first open the floor and then we come back to respond.
And then, yes, yeah, I think that would be more efficient.
So keep that.
Okay, I'll just start with here and then you can know that.
Thank you very much. I learned a lot of new things about Dasim and especially Assyrians and Kemalism, how Kemalism was perceived. And my question is to sorry, Adam? Ali. Ali talk about discrimination fairly about the schools and etc. But you underlined always as the main pillars of Turkish national identity the religion. But according to me, the new government was too, according to me, too secular. So secular that we are paying now some of their implementations. For example, the discrimination were not only against the Armenians or Greek Rooms. Also, as Cevat showed with the example of Dersim, also Kurds, and Kurds were Muslim people. Should we not underline more ethnicity than religion? Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I have a comment for Bahram's paper. So Bahram's paper actually enters into a largely uncharted area in Armenian studies, the post-genocide diaspora politics and different orientations. So that was actually one aspect of what was happening in that period. And these same people were also very much concerned with the Soviet Republic of Armenia and the Bolshevism. And Simon Vratsan was wrong twice in two regards. I mean, both in his prediction that Kemalism would not last long, and also in his prediction that Bolshevism would not last long. He had similar statement about Bolshevism, that it will also not last long. And therefore, he was convinced that, Armenian people outside Soviet Armenia should need to be prepared for the time when the Bolshevism collapses and they could come back to Armenia. So that's a parallel discourse developing in the same period. And it's developing within Dashnak Tutsun, which is also interesting. And Shahan Natali and this other group, these are the anti-Turkey, anti-Kemalists, anti-Turkish people. They want to have a stronger knowledge of Turkey, of what's going on in Turkey. Vratsan and his comrades are not very much concerned with what's going on in Turkey. They're more concerned of what's going on in Soviet Armenia. They want to come back to Soviet Armenia at the end. So what happens? Shahan Natali and his many comrades are expelled from expelled from the from Dashnak Tutsun in the between 1920 and 1932. This is a period when I expelled, because in part they were accusing Simon Vratsan and his comrade for collaborating with the Promethean movement as part of the Caucasian Union between with the former leaders of Azerbaijan and Georgia, of course, and who were supposedly sponsored by Poland and by Turkey. So basically, Shahan Natali criticized Simon Vratsan and his comrades for having a pro-Turkish orientation. So if this is so this is uncharted. So these are all areas in which more research needs to be done.
Also frictions between them regarding the assassination of the CUP leaders in Europe.
Yeah, of course, that also. And so in that regard, so there is no consensus in scholarship. I haven't seen any. If Armenians participated in the Promethean movement, what was their extent of involvement or not involvement? Well, the Dashnak Tutsun as a party did not participate, but some of his members may have participated, like Simon Vratsan and others, which may explain why their criticism of Turkey or the lack of interest in Turkey was kind of coming from. This is a brief comment, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a really fascinating panel and discussion. I have a question for Bahram. So you mentioned the Stalin's famous speech in 1927. May I learn the exact date of this speech, because it corresponds to Mustafa Kemal's speech too, Nutuk too, in the same year. Interestingly or coincidentally, this famous speech. Anyway, I was wondering, did you bump into or encounter?
May 13th.
Sorry?
May 13th, 1927.
Okay.
Everybody knows that.
Have you ever encountered any remark or any interpretation regarding the place of Salih Zeki within all these organizations, in Comintern, in Soviet Communist Party, and his relations with this party members and his role in the genocide and so forth? I was really curious about his place within all these organizations.
The Nutuk is in October. May versus October.
I had a question for Javad. So we've talked about this a little bit, about how the Jazeera and Darsim are places that maybe we can think about together. And what I was thinking about with Darsim is, okay, so you make this really nice point about roadlessness and who knows what roads are where and who can use what roads. And I'm wondering, when I think of Darsim, I think of air power and deployment of violence from the air in novel ways, and use of chemical weapons, Sabiha Gökçen, right? All of this. And so I'm wondering to what extent the geography of Darsim as this uncharted territory shapes that kind of violence. And to what extent people are talking about that explicitly at the time.
Thank you all for the papers.
You have a question?
Yeah. So thank you all for the papers. I learned a lot from all four. Javad, I have two questions. One is sort of basic. It's where was Antoine Guérisson from, and how did that shape the way you read his travelogue? And the second is somewhat related to Sam's question. Is I think in the paper you use the term internal colonialism once. Do you think in Dersim or in general, is there a useful distinction between colonialism and internal colonialism? Or is that sort of the internal part doing too much work, just saying, oh, it's within the nation state? Is there a real difference conceptually, at least for Dersim, or overall, if you'd like to expand?
Just go ahead. Go ahead.
We're definitely not making it easy on our panelists. Vahram, real quick. So you talk about a lot of like how these former these ARF party members are engaging with Kemalism and Turkey's future. I was also curious if in your research, if you see any of them also engaging with other parts of Kemalism, namely like the Turkish historical thesis, because I've seen in some of my own research, Arshak Alpoyacan and some others who were very big on history, writing in papers in the 1930s until the 1950s, even like challenging this notion that of Turkish primordialism and negation of the pre-Ottoman peoples who were there before the Ottoman conquest. Very quickly.
Question for David. David, I was wondering if you can elaborate on the role of religion in jihad, in especially destruction of the Assyrian population. Because when I look at the regions where the Assyrians already populated, vis-a-vis, for instance, the Western Armenia or the cities or provinces in Giligia, the role of jihad, the role of religion, religious discourse, and all these religious groups and tarikats who were so active and vibrant when the declaration of jihad was declared and Ottoman was involved in war and so forth. I always encounter this role of this discourse play a pivotal role in galvanizing and motivating, prompting the people, especially in those regions where the Assyrians were mostly populated, was much more effective and impactful vis-a-vis other regions as an independent variable in this whole destruction process.
Okay, let's have responses. Perhaps David, you want to start?
Okay.
Then we'll do another round.
That's nice. Okay. Rustam, you probably are right that since the Assyrian presence in Istanbul was so small, or maybe not even that, that meant that the minority rights expressed in the Lausanne Treaty were not really applicable to them. So maybe they were right that they were excluded, but they were excluded by geography, not by legal. Though, I mean, what happens after Lausanne in this area is maybe something for WATS 12 to discuss. But what we can see in the area is a total militarization of this southeastern boundary once it is decided upon. And the militarization is part of the negotiations for the Mosul boundary. What we can see also is a confiscation of buildings continuing, and Midyat turns into a military camp. I think that's about enough. But as to Ermit's question about the jihad being more effective, Florence Helliot-Bellier has written an entire book about the jihad in the Hakkari Iranian border area. It's one of the sons of Ubaidallah, who was a member of CUP, who is spreading jihad even before the war begins, because the border there is disputed between Turkey and Iran and Russia. And this means that the Russians were using the Christians against the Turks, and the Turks were using the Kurds, especially the Sunni ones, through jihad. I think both Halil and Ömer Najibey, also these are Teshkilat Masusi guys, were in the area before the First World War, spreading jihad ideas. So there's probably a lot that you can go in mine on that question.
Sabri Atman is writing a whole dissertation about it.
I'm trying to help it, yeah.
Was it effective?
As a mobilization tactic, obviously among rather illiterate people who were participating in the tribal warfare, yeah, it would seem.
Doubtful, but
well, I mean, they used it in rhetoric. We have a Kurdish leader by the name of Suto from the Hakkari Mountains, saying the last year we were participating in the jihad, writing to the Valley of Mosul and things like that.
In our main sources, especially personal accounts and memoirs, they say very effective.
Yeah, so
I would expect they would say that. Yeah. In Istanbul, no. They wrecked one restaurant, a famous hotel and restaurant, and it was over. And the Germans were against it, of course.
But the population,
you're going to use it. What about Muslims in India?
Well, it's sort of hard to say whether it's effective, but it was used. It was used, and it did seem to have popular response. There was, mostly when there were attacks on villages, you would have a green flag flying and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, who's next?
So let me start with the last question. Your question about the Turkish national movement being secular or religious. So
Entire.
So I argue that at the beginning, in 1920, 1921, it was definitely a religious movement, the Turkish national movement, because in 1920, 1921, how you unite these different ethnic Muslim population in Anatolia against Armenians, Greeks, and other allied powers? You know, there were not only Turks, you know, but also Turks, Kurds, you know, Laz people, Gürjis, Circassians, Bulgarian Pomaks, other groups. You know, how you unite these non-Muslim, these Muslim ethnic populations against Greek occupation. So at the beginning, the national boundaries drew to include all these Muslim groups, not only Turks. But what happened after 1924 with the constitution? So, 1921 constitution of Republic of Turkey or Grand National Assembly of Turkey, TBMM, didn't include any definition of Turkish nation. So it says egemenlik milletindir. It belongs to the nation. But there is no definition about the Turkish nation. But when you go to 1924 constitution, things changed. They started to include this Turkish nation, and they say all of the citizens of Republic considered as Turkish nation. So, and after that, actually, you have these differences between the Kurdish movement and the Kemalist movement, also with the reform of the abolishment of caliphate and the sultanate, and the secular movement starts, secular reform starts, and then actually you have this let's say problems with the Kurdish population and 1925 rebellion, Seyit Rizar movement. So so I argue that at the beginning the Turkish national movement has this religious dimension, because if you look at how Turkish national movement started against the occupation, it began with the occupation of Izmir by Greeks, and then you have this big Sultanahmet meeting in Istanbul. It actually motivated, let's say, Turks, Kurds, or Muslims in Anatolian Peninsula to struggle against the occupation, and plus with the appearance of Armenian Legion in the Cilicia. So these two things actually motivated the people, these Muslim people, to fight against the Allied occupation. Appearance of Armenian Legion in Cilicia and the appearance of Greek forces in Izmir. So that's why I say that it has a religious characteristic at the beginning. But after 1925, 1924, yes, it had more Turkish ethnicity approach. About other questions, why I use armistice complex rather than Serb syndrome. So there are a few reasons. First, I didn't want to use Serb syndrome because it is the language of official Turkish history and historiography. Treaty of Serb signed by the traitor Ottoman government in Istanbul, and then Mustafa Kemal comes, the struggle begins in Anatolia. So that's why I don't want to use Serb syndrome. And secondly, it's only about a treaty that was signed in 1920. But the approach of anti-Armenian approach of intellectuals, actually, they accused of Armenians for the whole armistice period, for their activities in 1918, 1919. So that's why I think it gives a broader, a comprehensive approach. And thirdly, if you say syndrome, you give this agency to the victims, to the other side. And as far as I know, if it's a syndrome, it should be like physical symptoms as well. So that's why I only use complex. It's a more psychological reaction rather than a physical reaction. So did the pro-Turkish policy of Armenians have any good for the community at that time? From what I see from the publications of our Turkish authors, it didn't have any good, but they were able to keep their schools open, during the Republican years. So maybe because of these struggle that they show at that time, because of this, maybe they were able to keep their schools open and learn the Armenian language. Was allowed to teach Armenian language in those schools.
And Ari went to one of those.
Yeah. I was a graduate of Getronagan High School in Istanbul.
Going strong.
Now it's gone.
Going strong. No, it's there.
So thank you for the great questions, Hakim, and thank you for your comments. I'm dealing with the question of continuity in the historical context that I'm working on, but of course, history doesn't stop by World War II, and Dersim continues to evolve in a different, mostly as part of the Kurdish question. Now it's the Armenian question is largely eliminated, even though it plays a very central role in shaping local history. And in some ways, I would say Dersim was a bigger taboo in Turkey than even the Armenian genocide, because there was an intellectual circle beyond Turkey who could talk about Armenian genocide, but Dersim was basically disappeared from the map and the public space of Turkey until early 2000s, and then it re-emerges and takes the kind of central stage in political debates for around a decade. And Erdogan's politics of Dersim was purely rhetorical, and the end result shows that it was purely rhetorical only because the main opposition party leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who was recently defeated by his rival, is originally from Dersim, and so he used his being from Dersim as a rhetoric to basically push back on him, claiming that you represent a party that is responsible for massacring your own people. And you should be ashamed of this. So that was all his point. All the apology and everything else is just pure rhetoric, because even most of the archives on Dersim are still not open to researchers, the military archives. So the Dersim question continues to haunt the state elite in Turkey, despite all the speeches and all the discussions and debates about it recently. And Samuel, for comparing Dersim to Tunceli, to Dersim to Jazira, and your question about, let me first try to address your question regarding geography, the role of geography. It is, I treat Dersim as a region where Armenian, Kurdish, and Kızılbaş questions come together, and they come together largely due to the geography that has made the state's job difficult to control this region. And I think as in Antranik's quote that I mentioned, in some ways it actually Dersim is famous is known for its mountains and the rivers that surround it, and a lot of outsiders considered it. They said it looks like an island. We could not penetrate here. And in that regard, in terms of how geography prevented modern state from colonizing this region, there are a lot of parallels between deserts and the mountains. The deserts for the Bedouins was also an uncontrollable, difficult to penetrate regions, and these local communities were deeply embedded in these geographies. In the mountains, the rivers, everything, the local tribal and the religious system was largely part of that geography, and the same goes with the Bedouins who are accustomed to live in that kind of a landscape. And I think one of the motivations that I have in mind is to make these parallels more obvious. As in the case of Jazira, that's a different geographical configuration, and in Çukurova, Chris Christians, is actually making similar points. So geography was central, and the state elites were aware. They always referred geographic barriers in Dersim before the penetration of Ottoman modernism. And the roads, I didn't mention in my talk, but they come up with the idea of roadlessness, yolsuzluk, as the main problem in Dersim. And this word yolsuzluk, it takes on different meanings over time and becomes, currently it means in contemporary Turkish, it means corruption. And I think there is a historical connotation between its understanding roadlessness identified as by the state elite as a place of corruption, disorder, anarchy, all these things. They thought if we could build roads, we could solve all these problems that exist in Turkey. So that's why I originally came up with roadlessness. But I also have in mind to have something published titled Roads to Civilization. So they thought that if they build the road, these people will be connected to civilization by working in the construction of the road, and then by being connected to civilized regions beyond their sim. And they ultimately cannot overcome these geographical barriers until 1930s. And Fevzi Çakmak, when he visits Dersim in 1931, the first road that was built, he says, he arrives there with a military vehicle and says, these people, first time they saw a military vehicle there and they are shocked. And he says, we started building this road in 1848. So it took 100 years to build a road from Elazığ through Dersim to Erzincan. And they definitely consider, as in the map making, road making was another continuing process that they followed closely. And ultimately, it's the air power that actually overcomes this geographical barriers, as we all know, the bombings and the poison gas. But I think the more interesting connection there is the connection with the Nazi Germany, where they got the gas, and a lot of German engineers were involved in building these roads and bridges in 1930s. And those connections need to be more explored more in detail. And finally, in Aram's, I tried to find information about Antranik Yerintsiyan and whether he is the same Antranik with the revolutionary leader Antranik. Might be, I couldn't find much information about him, but the responses are mostly negative, as I just see. But we don't know who this Antranik is. He must have been a prominent person or coming from a privileged background, because it seems that he was visiting there when he was 14 years old with an entourage that was, accompanying him. He says, "I'm so excited. My heart beats with excitement. I am in the 14th of spring of my life, and we are going to Dersim, this place where everybody talks about, nobody has seen." And then he goes there. My impression is that he initially goes with a lot of negative images of the Dersimis, because he tries to only talk to Armenians in the region. And then after spending some time there, he ends up being really building close relations with the Kurds, and then he starts a more positive image of the region. And is there a difference between internal colonialism and colonialism? That's a question that I actually asked to the different people. And at some point, I think, especially in the Middle Eastern context, it's really doesn't make much sense to distinguish between colonialism and internal colonialism, because all the practices from knowledge production to military and the use of violence is quite similar to, let's say, French colonialism in Algeria. Like when you look at the reports, the way they have been racialized, orientalized, and then ultimately militarily occupied and ended up in some sort of a secular, settled colonialism, which goes on. Maybe the difference is that the colonialism in Algeria has ended at some point, whereas in places like Dersim and other parts of the region, maybe today Afrin or northern Syria, continues to be a colonial experience. Thank you.
Yes, if I may just continue on this part, the decade of the 1880s is a fascinating decade for the travelers. Judging from the surname of this Andrei Geritsyan, I think he was from the Russian Empire. And why I'm saying this, because at the same time, we see other Russian-educated Armenians who were traveling to Turkish Armenia. So I'm currently preparing a book to publish, a travel notes of an Armenian who studied in St. Petersburg, whose name was Levon Sarkisyan. So this guy travels from Nakhichevan to Trapezon in 1888 and leaves very detailed notes about his remarks. He spends 2 weeks in Erzurum, Garin. And I think when you mentioned that, I think there was I guess there was a movement among Armenians, especially in Russia, Russian-educated Armenians, to go and travel and discover Turkish Armenia. So we may look into that, try to see if there are interesting parallels into that. Now, thanks for the remarks and summarizing our key points. I think why Armenians, especially the first category that I've discussed, had this kind of views of distrust, revanchism against the Kemalist Turkey. I think it's just a self-justification of the rationale of the existence of their failure. If I can be, it's my own interpretations. Because look, it's the year 1925. Dashnakhtsun was coming out of an internal crisis. Largely, they are seen as the ones who were responsible for the collapse of the First Armenian Republic. Simon Barasyan was also one of the, he was also one of the masterminds of the February rebellion against Bolsheviks in 1921. So with this huge baggage, he goes to the Middle East, to Lebanon, and then to France, and then he comes back. And then, of course, he has to try to rationalize the failure. And not only he is urging Armenians to be ready to go back and to count the days when the Kemalist regime will collapse, but he's also urging Armenian Kurds to align with them, and so that they can go ahead and benefit from the collapse. And when Sam was discussing yesterday allegories, Armenians were also using these allegories to describe the dying nature of the Kemalist regime. And it's really fascinating how this dead body as an allegory was used to describe the Kemalist regime. So when it comes to Vahe's important remark, so what is really missing in this paper, and I think I'm going to work on that definitely, is exactly post-genocide diaspora politics. All the way until the 1930s, the things that were happening and all the decisions of Dashnakhtsun congresses, they need to be incorporated into this paper, because now I realize that part was really missing, because it does explain the change of mind in 1928-29, because starting from the 1930s, you don't see this detailed account of Turkish politics. You don't see accounts of interpreting that Kemalis is going to fail. But after the Second World War, this kind of thinking returns. Armenians after 1945 start to again herald that it seems the Kemalist regime is going to collapse, and Soviet Union is going to help us with that. Umid, your question about 1927, it is really interesting period. I don't think there is any correlation between the Congress, the JHP Congress, and Stalin's speech. But what is interesting is how Soviet observers have covered that Congress. And they went there on purpose. A big delegation from the Soviet, mostly journalists. And when they were discovering, they were very critical of that Congress. They were critical of Mustafa Kemal, so that he gave self-congratulatory speech, and they were very tired listening to him for 6.5 days. But what is interesting that they were saying that this guy there's no way Mustafa Kemal can succeed. This Kemalist movement remains an urban movement. It doesn't go into the rural areas. It remains very elitist movement. So you see that in 1927, how Soviet observers are clearly mentioning that. They're also saying that this CHP remains, the membership in CHP was very low, and they were saying they have to learn from the communists how communists were becoming more popularized. More popular party in the Soviet Union. So there was also a layer of ridiculing. You could also see that by Soviet observers. Armen, and when it comes to your question, we don't see. I haven't found how Armenians were interpreting the 1930s, especially Turkish history thesis and other manifestations. But I'm sure there is coverage on that. But what is interesting, how the Soviet Union interpreted this. The chairman of the Soviet Academy of Sciences went to that Congress of the Turkish history thesis. He was present. He was invited as a special guest. Later on, he was assassinated. He fell victim to Stalinist purges. I couldn't find the link, but at that time, you could see again in how Soviet observers in the 1930s were so critical of that Congress, saying that, well, this guy has lost his mind, Mustafa Kemal. There is no way he can prove the world that the Sun theory and all other outlandish ideas were going to be implemented. So, stop it here. Yes.
Thank you guys for a great panel. This was really enlightening. So let me start with Bahram, because you just finished. There are no Ramgavars in your paper, but you can't do everything in a short paper, but it'd be really interesting to know what the liberal bourgeois kind of elements thought. I've always been impressed that, and maybe Vaha will agree or not agree, they're like two diaspora nations. Right. So I grew up between them because we were Harajdi Magans, means progressives or communists. And we were between Dashnags and these bourgeois liberals. And but you either went to one party or you went to the other party, or one church or the other church. And they didn't speak the same language. They were so different, in terms of the way they conceived of things. Aramgavars made an association agreement with, basically they gave in to the Soviets and recognized Dashnags not until very, very late. So that's really interesting to see how that all plays out. What I want to talk about or ask you about is, it's very interesting, the Western views of Kemalism in American political science. So when I studied the history of American political science, trying to figure out what this was that I had now been dragooned into it in Chicago, when you look at the 1920s, when American political science is beginning to formulate serious kinds of research, early it was all kinds of other things. Woodrow Wilson was a political scientist as well as a racist and other things. But anyway, they were very concerned with a new problem. And I can't remember the actual term, but it was something like political consolidation. How do these new regimes, Bolsheviks, Kemalists, and Mussolini, Hitler hadn't come yet, how could they consolidate their hold on the population and move them in a different direction? And this was really a big concern. There was this guy at Chicago who was president of the American Political Science Association. As you move forward and the dominant paradigm of American political science becomes modernization theory, liberal modernization theory, not Marxist modernization theory, that is Weberian modernization theory, Turkey is a model. This is a positive model of how to modernize, right? And Kemalism, there's a guy who was either born or raised in Turkey named, have you come across this name, anybody? Dankworth? You can't remember the name. Dankworth Rustam. He was incredibly famous. He was the head of the APSA, the American Political Science Center. What?
He was at Princeton.
Yeah, he was at Princeton. And what was his view? You know, Turkey was the way you should modernize.
Like Japan.
Because it wasn't communist, because it wasn't Bolshevik. So during the Cold War, when America was ready to accept forms of dictatorship and authoritarianism, as long as they were capitalists and anti-communist, Turkey was a model. And these were the brave soldiers who fought in Korea. I can remember that from my youth, etc. They were particularly ruthless, but they were effective. So that's really interesting, the way in which Turkey became so positive. And the question I want to ask you is, can you tell me or a little more about the content, because it's not quite in the paper, of Stalin's definition of Kemalism? What are the ingredients? I didn't get that. On Jevdot, I thought it was really interesting paper, and the way you put your triad of state, nation, territory is really, really interesting. And because what is the modern nation? What is the discourse of the modern nation? It's that culture determines your right to politics, to autonomy or home or statehood or a homeland, a piece of territory. And this is a modern thing. And look how fast people in that area pick this up. On Adi, was it in your paper that Sevr became something positive for some people to use? That is the Ottoman government or the pre-Kemalist government was thinking that there's something you could get out of Sevr, or was it in someone else's paper? It was in your paper. So this would be interesting to bring together, right? Because that was brand new to me. That was inconceivable that such a thing could be true. So I was wondering about that. And finally, with David, this paper is brilliant and so new and so interesting. But it's interesting, two things. The international factor, which seems really important. It's these people are inconveniently positioned, geographically located on the frontier. So they're in Hakkari and Mosul, and they're going to get smashed because the British imperialists are going to use them to try to get the border put wherever it was ultimately put. And I think that has to be brought out more, but it's very good. And they're also constructed as rebels very early on. And I discovered, to my surprise, writing the book about genocide, that killing started with Assyrians on the frontier of the empire. So those are more comments than questions, but anything you can add, I'd love to hear. Who else is gonna? Okay, over there, Melissa.
Or not. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the thread of internal colonialism. So this is mainly for Javad and I guess Aram's question, but I kind of want to push back on those being the same thing, because I think there's like I find it to be a useful distinction, honestly more useful than like extractive versus settler colonialism, for instance, because as far as I know, it is that distinction's coined by African-American theorists first. Like that is its initial use is by Du Bois, even earlier people, because it is like a nation within a nation, that sort of thing. So it kind of implies, it doesn't kind of imply, it is like in this case, it's a little like it's, Americans don't go out and conquer their lands. These people are already there. And it is a very modern construction, like, because he's not talking about slavery at that time. It's like, it's a bit more into, I think that essay is written in like 1930 something, 1940, the latest. So it is about like a more, it is a situation in which there's an industrial society and then there's like an in-group that is very, very much sidelined. And I always read it as more like a phenomenon, more contemporary to us, more so than I would say 17th, 18th century colonial endeavors and whatnot. And like you're looking at it like a long, long period. And I think that the coinage of internal colonialism is like towards the end of like it's around when the Tunceli operation is happening. So it's like it's a very modern thing. And how you were describing it is like, you know, Dersim has been a part of the Ottoman Empire for a very long time. And while sounds like it was inextricable, there's also, I think, the part of like, you know, early modern or maybe even pre-modern states didn't have the reach that modern states had. And like, I think internal colonialism has a lot to do with that, because like the power and the knowledge that the modern states have over its citizen subjects is way more than any pre-modern anything had, like pre-the industrial era, I would say. So they have less information to begin with. And then I guess in the case that you're talking about, that persisted throughout state power really becoming industrialized, bureaucratized, modernized. And that was like kind of like an internal other. So I don't know, I just went on for too long, but I think internal colonialism really works in that. And I wouldn't actually, I think like it works better generally in this, you know, in the part of the world that we're talking about, but just wanted to flag that.
I have a question, Ron. To you.
Question to me?
Yeah.
Okay.
You thought, yeah, I agree. The Western powers supported the Turkey because of this is the way without communism, a modernization. But we can say opposite. Soviet Union supported Turkey because that was the way without capitalism, modernization, and they supported so much that the Soviet Unionist Turkish Communist Party stopped their activities because Soviet Union Socialist Party ordered. And in Turkey, they were Kemalists who were communists. A kind of course. For example, the periodic kadro, Şevket Süreyya, Aydemir, Yakup Kadri, Karaosmanoğlu, Vedat Nedim Tör, they only published this periodic to impose Mustafa Kemal, to affect him to be a socialist, a kind of socialist. They said, so we are coming from Ottoman Empire, private property is not important, without classes, we can continue. This is a kind of maybe a mirror from one side, you said, the Western powers, but also the Soviet Union supported because of the same reason.
I'll let Bahram answer this question because he knows more about this. The only thing I remember is that the alliance with Kemalism was against the greatest imperial power. It was against British imperialism. And that's the rhetoric I hear from, say, Chicherin and Lenin and so forth. Yeah. But this may also be true.
I just want to say one comment about Murad's comment about Ari and the way religion became it was based on religious identity, and then it moved into a more secular. I think the way I read it, that even before the establishment of the Republic, the Turkishness and Armenianness and Rumness became racialized in a way that when we are speaking about an Armenian, it's not about their confession, rather than the confession became racialized or ethnicized in a way that it became a racial marker. And that's why Armenians, for example, could never become assimilated into Turkishness, because no matter what they do, it is something inherently essential in them. So just a comment, if anyone wants to address it, or maybe over tea, that's perfectly fine. So we have 10 minutes or 11 minutes? Yeah.
Yeah.
Kurds also couldn't be assimilated. Kurds
couldn't
be assimilated.
But much easier.
They could assimilate. It could be. Yeah.
No, I'm saying that Kurds could be assimilated,
Armenians couldn't.
But Armenians couldn't, particularly because being Christians or being non-Muslim, they can never be Turks.
Okay.
But Kurds, as Muslims, could be nothing but Turks.
That's what a possibility you are saying. Yeah.
Can I just add a footnote to that? And then this is the fact, if you say these identities are being racialized, I want to just make sure that we don't understand that as meaning immutable. Because you can convert, and then that is sort of an entry ticket. But it's also true. It's also true that being Muslim is sort of the primary identifier for large swaths of the population at that time. And
Which time?
This reaches into the 1930s. If you read about the way, for instance, the Kemalists finagled the annexation of Hatay, right? In which they forced the population, more or less, of that Sanjak to identify as either Turk or Arab. The choice was actually not one of just looking around your family and say, okay, I'm this or that. The choice is political. And many of them did not think of this as a sort of a priori category. I mean, we should keep that in mind when I think about it. And this is one of the reasons why to call the early Kemalism project a religious movement makes me a little bit uneasy. But I realize that it's a religious category that defines those involved in it. Just want to
2 minutes each.
We need a new conference on Kemalism. What is Kemalism?
Right. So this is interesting how Murat's comment came after what Ran said. So in 1927, in May, Stalin he sets up the meeting to meet with Chinese students who were studying in Moscow, and he staged a question. So one student asked him a question like, "Is a Kemalist revolution possible in China?" So, and then he goes on and he defines Kemalism. And his definition of Kemalism is that it's a revolution from above. It's a bourgeois revolution. The next stage is agrarian revolution. So, and it is, according to Kemal, according to Stalin, it is stuck between this revolution, that revolution. But this language was picked up by all observers in Soviet Union. They kept using that kind of thinking and reasoning when interpreting the Kemalist, interpreting Kemalism. But it was not it. After 3 months, he goes again and explains why the Kemalist revolution is not possible in China. His speech, Stalin's speech, causes a fraction within the Communist Party. 3 people go against him and write books that why the Kemalist revolution is possible in China. So there was a huge debate in 1927 in Soviet Union that the Kemalist revolution should be exported to China. At the same time in Iran, so how Soviet Union was interested of exporting the Kemalist revolution, Kemalism also to Iran. And there were lots of discussions with the Iranian leadership, and when you read the ambassadors' reports about that, you see that there's an excitement, as if Kemalism is about to be successfully imported to Iran. So that's that. Yes, Ron. I in the final part of my paper, I do accept the limitation that Ramkabar and other parties are also not there. So that's why I casted the net in a way that it was enough for one paper, but it turned out that there's more than there's more to discuss in this. So yes, very short.
Well, I'm not saying that the Kemalist movement was a religious movement. What I'm trying to say is that Kemalist movement was a movement of Anatolian Muslims against the non-Muslims, such as Greeks and Armenians. So that's a different thing. I mean, if you say religious movement.
These were your words.
Yeah, sorry if I'm misunderstood.
He's clarifying.
Yeah, I'm just trying to clarify.
This
So-
is why the idea of Anatolian Civil War makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, what I'm trying to clarify is that by the way, from 1929 to 1924, it was a movement. The national boundaries they drew to include all of the Muslims. But after 1924, with the constitution, at that time they included what Turkish nation means at that time. So then we have, then you see the other problems with other groups. All of the other Muslim populations were seen as that they could be assimilated, but they couldn't assimilate Kurds and Zazas and and Alevis. So, but what about the other populations like Circassians, Pomaks, Bulgarian Pomaks, Laz, or other groups? They were assimilated during the Republican years after following decades. Yeah.
The laws, yeah, you need someone to take care of the bees.
Yeah, okay, wow. Okay, Ron, the thought that the Assyrians are simply in the wrong place because they get smashed because of the border issue. Would that sort of imply a historical reasoning that if Turkey had gotten the Mosul Vilayet instead, that the Assyrians would be in place and thriving? Probably not.
No. They still move them with, they'll still move them.
And just to add a quick note to the discussion about Assyrians not being recognized, I don't remember the name, but maybe Ümit remembers during our conference at Northwestern on Lausanne, there was someone who was making the case that they did not want to be recognized as a minority for different reasons. But I don't know if that's something that came across, which was interesting because everyone else was trying to be recognized as a minority, but the Assyrians were not. So regarding the debate about internal colonialism, yes, it does start with the African Americans as a form of internal exploitation, which actually hits I think a dead end in 1970s and 80s as that discussion becomes a class issue and then and the race issue, and then the debate about internal colonialism kind of disappears. And of course we can still use it as a useful category, but what strikes me when I compare what happens in Dersim and in other colonial cases, in 1937 when the military operations in Dersim is about to finish, the Prime Minister İsmet İnönü makes a speech in the parliament, and actually this is his final speech. He says the homeland gained 7,000 something kilometers of land and 76,000 something of population, and he's basically treating this as a foreign land. Whereas when you look at the French claim in Algeria, it's like they say Algeria is part of France. So that one resembles more like an internal colonialism than the Turkish case, the Dersim case. So I think, and all the mechanisms of power that functions makes that idea of internal colonialism, the internal part of it, meaningless. And actually using the term internal also legitimizes state territory. What is state territory at the end? I mean, the borders, it's all about power. Why Dersim is internal for whom? If you look from the Turkish perspective, it's internal, but then this is not something that the Dersimis would necessarily identify as being part of. So in that regard, I think I'm not totally against the concept, but I think there are some tensions that needs to be addressed.
Perfect timing.
If you all